when it comes back to that initial question of, can America ever really go bankrupt? And I guess the simple answer is, well, no, because we can just continue to print money, out of and make sure that we don't actually hit that. The problem is that with that, you run the risk of inflation and hyperinflation along those rates. Hey guys, Dustin here, and one of the coolest days of my life was really when my wife and I were able to say that we were debt-free. I mean, when we got married, she brought on a bunch of college loans, and I had, car loans, and frankly, I was an idiot with my money. Self-admitted, it's all right. But I mean, the day that we were actually able to kind of pour in over the couple years of actually paying down these debts, we actually became debt-free years ago. And actually, it's been a phenomenal experience for us. But I know that not everyone is able to say that. Not everyone's so lucky to live like it. In fact, the consumer debt here in America is close to $15 trillion. I mean, this has been steadily rising throughout the years, and last year in 2020 was the worst year in a long time. Now, when you break this down by category, when you look at the things that each consumer and each person's really kind of falling under, when you look at student loan debt, almost $39,000 in debt because of student loans. When you look at car loans, about $20,000. Credit card debts, $6,000. I thought that'd be a lot higher personally, and then mortgages, I mean, that's almost $210,000 that's putting people in debt. Now, of course, you could argue good debt, bad debt, and all that kind of stuff, but it made me think, what about America? What about taking this out from the family and taking this out to the country? I mean, could America ever really go bankrupt? And we're going to look at that today. I feel like in order to address this question, we really need to understand where we're currently at. So if I look at 2020 figures, America as a country pulled in about $3.42 trillion in tax revenue. We actually spent about $6.55 trillion. Now, again, we can see right off the bat here that there is a deficit. There is a shortfall. We are spending more money than we have. As Dave Ramsey says, you run out of money before you run out of month, right? I mean, so this is what we're looking at here for the country. The other thing I think that's important to look at is the difference in our spending. When I look at, there's really two different types of spending that the government has. One is what we call mandatory spending, and this is things that we have to pay for. This is things like paying down the interest on our debt that we currently have. We also afford money to Social Security. We also give money to Medicare and different organizations like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. I mean, so we give money to these things, and these are what we call mandatory spending. These are things that do not need to go through a process of appropriation through Congress, through whoever, to get these spending approved. Now, the second type is what we call discretionary spending. I mean, this is spending like everything outside of that. I mean, think of paying for our military and our veteran affairs. Think about paying for agriculture subsidies. Think about paying for transportations and roads, our courts, our logistical system. I mean, all those things have to be paid, and that's what we call discretionary spending. Now, actually, when you look at the data here, the mandatory spending takes up about 60% of our spending. So when I dive deeper into that discretionary spending, if I take the $6.55 trillion that we brought in, or that we spent last year, and I take 60% of that, that brings me down to $3.9 trillion. Now, again, we brought in 3.42, so there's already a shortfall. Again, so going back to that quote earlier, we're running out of money before we run out of month. In fact, if you stop all discretionary spending, if you stop paying for the military, if you shut it down, you shut down the whole court system, if you shut down all the transportation, everything else outside of the mandatory spending, you still run out of money mid-October. So you still run out of money where you can't afford to pay anything else. It's kind of a troubled place to be in. So if I take a look at the U.S. debt clock, if I look at what we currently have for debt, we can easily see here that the U.S. national debt is up above $28 trillion. Now, I think the problem here is that when we look at this number, it's almost, you can't understand just how big of a number this is. And maybe it's just for me personally, but it's so hard to grasp how big $28 trillion really is. I mean, if I take this bracket and I try to break it down in a way that we can kind of maybe make sense of it a little bit, right? If I spent $1 every second, and since we don't know what the future is and we don't have any reference points, let's go back to the history. So if I take $1 per second and I go back 1 million seconds into the past, that takes me back to 11 days and about 13 hours and some change. So again, almost 2 weeks ago, That puts me back at 1 million seconds. Now, if I take this out to 1 billion seconds, right? If I go back in the history, 1 billion seconds, $1 per second, back that far, that brings me back about 31 years. That brings us back to 1990. So if I go back 1 billion seconds or 31 years back to 1990, what were some of those amazing things that happened? Well, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was finally released from prison. Hubble Space Telescope was actually launched in outer space and gave us the beautiful image, one of many that have come out through the years, called the Cosmic Reef. Operation Desert Shield kicks off as American troops landed in Saudi Arabia and started pushing into Iraq. East and West Germany had their reunification. I mean, what an amazing thing that happened 31 years ago or 1 billion seconds ago, where two countries were at war and then came together as one. And now Germany is a fantastic country where I lived there for about 3.5 years. Love the place. Fantastic. If I take this deeper to even 1 trillion, I mean, again, if I spend $1 per second, if I go back 1 trillion seconds, that takes me all the way back to over 31,000 years. In fact, it's about 31,688 years. Now, to put things again in perspective, the oldest known civilization is the Sumerian civilization, and they have them kind of living about 5,000 years ago, right? So our 1/6 of a trillion seconds. So again, we're not even quite to that 1 trillion seconds here. This is 5,000 years ago. The Sumerian civilization was around. Now, recently we found another kind of temple site in Turkey called, I'm going to ruin this name, I apologize, but Göbekli Tepe? I mean, I don't know how you say it. But anyways, so this one here, they think was around about 8,000 BC or 10,000 years ago. Again, now we're back to 1/3 of 1 trillion seconds. So 10,000 years ago, this place here in Turkey had humans, and we're building things, and we're building temples and whole structures where people would live. Again, we're 1/3 of a trillion seconds. So when you put things into perspective that way, 1 trillion, let alone 28 trillion, is a huge number. And so if I spend $1 per every second, and I go back to the debt clock of $28 trillion in debt here in America, that takes you out to almost 900,000 years. Now, the interesting thing about our debt is that, again, we have $28 trillion of debt, what we call on the books, so to speak. There's another thing called unfunded liabilities. And if I look back at the debt clock, you can see here that we have over $86 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Now, question, of course, is what is an unfunded liability? So an unfunded liability refers to liabilities that are not covered or backed up by assets. So if a pension fund or other type of fund has projected debts that exceed its current capital and projected income and investment returns, it has a unfunded liability. So in other words, a pension liability is a difference between the total amount due to retirees and the amount of money the fund actually has to make those payments. So again, if I have a retirement fund and I'm getting a pension from my company per se, and they don't have the money readily available to pay me that pension or that retirement funds or that whatever it is, that is an unfunded liability. In America, we have $86 trillion in total debt, which includes that unfunded liabilities. So, of course, now I have to take this a little bit further for visualization. But if I took 86 trillion seconds, that takes me back to 2.8 million years ago. Let's call it 3 million for easy math, because what's a couple of years between friends, right? If you went back then, of course, I mean, life would be a little better because according to science, the waves and the sea levels are about 53 feet higher. So again, if I have 86 trillion seconds or $1 per second, that takes me back almost 3 million years. I mean, quite a different earth that we live on then as we do back then.
Okay, so you're probably saying, I got it, Dustin. America's in debt.
I mean, going back to our question of, could America ever really go bankrupt? We're going to get there in a second, but let's first talk about the dangers of having this much debt. Recently, the CFO for Costco, Richard Galanti, actually stated this in an interview, and that is, In some cases, there will be rises about 20% increase in costs for essential goods, and like meat and other crucial operational expenses, like for shipping containers and aluminum foil and whatever else, right? But the other thing that's interesting too is that it's not just the cost of goods, right? It's going to be higher labor costs. It's going to be higher freight costs. It's going to be higher transportation. I mean, all these things for high commodity is going to raise in prices, right? While companies like Costco and other, big corporations are trying to mitigate the risk and really the negative sides of this debt, they're going to try to mitigate as best they can. But really what it comes down to is that, according to the CFO, again, for Costco, that some of the inflation has passed through and will continue to pass through in the forms of higher prices at the checkout line. And so again, the danger of this is when you print about a quarter of the money in circulation since January 2020, about a year and a half ago, the dangers of this is going to lead to inflation. And in fact, we've seen that the inflation is the highest it's been in a very long time, right? And we see that the problem so much isn't how much money you're bringing home, it's the power that that money has to purchase goods and services. So again, if you are having more money, but the cost of goods is increasing over time, you actually have a net loss and a higher tax on you. And that's why a lot of economists call inflation the silent tax. And if things are not handled and are not taken care of, frankly, quite rapidly, we run the danger of running into what we call a hyperinflation. Now, if we look at our debt to GDP, we're already above 100%. And this is where a lot of economists say drastic measures have to take place to come back from that mark. Now, when it comes to hyperinflation, I mean, we have some great examples in the recent history. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Hungary, Yugoslavia, but also countries in the past like China and Germany and France, who were actually able to, through different measures and policies, able to restrict their spending and actually bring their debt a little bit under control. So without that, without those measures, America as a whole can actually have some pretty tough changes and some tough times in front of us. So to sum things up here, I plan on making a second video going into, I guess, the future of America and really some of the policies that are coming out in regards to how this will affect. But when it comes back to that initial question of, can America ever really go bankrupt? And I guess the simple answer is, well, no, because we can just continue to print money, out of and make sure that we don't actually hit that. The problem is that with that, you run the risk of inflation and hyperinflation along those rates. The answer would be essentially, no, America can't go bankrupt. But do we really want to get to that point where we really test that question out? You see, America doesn't really have a revenue problem. I mean, as you said before, we pulled in a little bit over $3 trillion and we're spending over $6 trillion. So it's not really a revenue problem. It's more so a spending problem. If I look at, again, trying to visualize just the concept of how big this number is, if I spent $1 billion a day to pay down my debt, if I take that $28 trillion mark for our U.S. debt, it would take us about almost 77 years. Now, if I took the total unfunded liabilities, the total debt of America at $86 trillion, and I spent $1 billion a day without growing any more debt, if I spent $1 billion a day, that would take us almost 236 years to essentially pay down the debt that we currently have. So again, not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem that we need to get under control. And as always, best wishes, take care, be awesome. Hey, so I'd love to hear what you guys think. I mean, let me know down in the comments what you guys think as far as, have we reached that tipping point? Or what do we need to do to correct this problem? And if you'd like to hear more content about this, again, I will be making a second video about this, about the future of America. But if you'd like to see more about some of the videos I'm putting out, click like, subscribe. Love to hear your comments down below. Take care.